Have you ever noticed how much of life is about doing the same things over and over and over again? Most days aren't full of big celebrations or special occasions or special moments. They're about doing things that we always do and doing them again and again. Sometimes it's things that we have on our to-do list every single week. Sometimes it's even more mundane than that. We don't even take the time to put them on our lists because they're so frequent. Doing the dishes, doing laundry and folding the clean wash, cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner, going to work. In some cases, the very essence of who we are, the fabric of our being, is part of the repetition of life. If you're a parent, you know what this is like. When you go to bed at night, you're a parent. When you wake up in the morning, you're still a parent. Even while you sleep, you're a parent, as sometimes we're reminded by nightmares and kids crawling into bed with us, and that upset stomach that goes into convulsions. If you're a first responder or a medical person, you know what this is like. Because if you're on call, it doesn't matter what time of the day or night it is. When the alarm goes off, you have to respond. You do this over and over again. If you work a job, it's not a question in the morning when you get up whether you're going to go to work or not. Unless you have vacation or personal days to use, you go to work because it's the way that you provide for your family. If you're a school student, when you get up in the morning, you do your schoolwork. And if you're a boss, at least in some cases, you may get a call at any time to respond to a situation because you're in charge. If you have a medical condition, a very serious one that you've lived with long term, you don't wake up in the morning and say, do I want to have diabetes today? Or MS? Or whatever it may be. It's part of who you are. So much of life is about doing the same things over and over again. This time of year, we're reminded of something that we have to do on a regular basis: mowing the lawn. One of the great themes of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, is the theme of obedience and disobedience between the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, and God's commands to them. God will tell them, do this or refrain from that. Not because he's a control freak, but because he created each human being. He even created you and me. And he knows what's best for us. Just like oftentimes a parent knows what is best for their child because they have the experience to know what will serve them best in life. We see this in Numbers chapter 32. And there we see the story of 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel before they have gained the promised land that God has set aside for them to live in. And 2 of these tribes, the Reubenites and the Gadites, decide that they have found the perfect land that they would be happy to settle down in. And they're going to settle their flocks and their families in that area. And they're going to refrain from helping the other 10 tribes of Israel defeat the enemy that occupies the promised land in which they're supposed to take. And there we see an important idea. When these tribes' leaders go to Moses and declare that they're going to do this, Moses has a fit, because he's reminded of what has already taken place in Israel's history, that they are currently wandering around in the wilderness for an entire generation, waiting for that generation to die as punishment for not being obedient to God and following His ways. He doesn't want history to repeat itself. He doesn't want another generation to have to experience what the current generation is going through. The good news of this passage is that these two tribes' leaders decide that they will actually join in the fight for all of Israel and not just look out for their own well-being. The term wandering, which is used in Numbers 32 and in other places in the Old Testament to describe this theme of obedience and disobedience, literally means to go up and down. I think a lot of us have this image of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness through this flat, sandy ground. And for sure, there were lots of places that were flat and there were lots of places that were sandy. But the wilderness was much more rugged than that. Today, we might use as a good translation of this term wander to go back and forth, to do the mundane thing over and over and over again. In fact, in Numbers chapter 33, we see a place-by-place list of all the locations that the Israelites travel to during these 40 years. I've often thought about those 40 years, and I wonder, what did the Israelites do during those 4 decades? In a lot of ways, I think that their story is our story. Not just during this time where we're confined to certain spaces, but in all of life, where we have to do the same things over and over and over again. It's in the crucible of the mundaneness, the routine, the rhythm of life, that so often our character is revealed. It's not the big high moments. It's not moments when things are going right. It's when we're doing the regular, everyday things that who we truly are is revealed. And we're reminded in the scriptures that we belong to God, that we're His children, His sons and daughters, and we're called to walk in obedience with Him. I really like what one commentator has to say on this topic of wandering, of doing the mundane, the rhythmic things of life, of obedience and disobedience. He says, if people considered as they ought what would be the end of sin, then they would be afraid of the beginning of it. What does he mean by saying that? He means that if we would consider the ramifications, the results, the fallout, the brokenness, the pain and hurt that we cause not only in our lives but also in the people around us and their lives, we might put the brakes on quicker. We might stop ourselves in our tracks and turn back to God and not engage in that broken behavior. One of the great concerns that I have for us every single day, and especially during this time when many of us have more time on our hands, we're cooped up, we don't get to have as much interaction with one another, is that we would be led astray down a sinful path in the mundaneness of life. It's important to note that the first 5 books of the Bible, known collectively as the books of Moses or the Torah, simply teaching, that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that they start with a promise to Abraham, the head of all of the nation of Israel, in Genesis chapter 12, making a promise to him that God will use Israel as his people to bless all the nations of the earth, and that he will give them a special land, which in the Middle East is just about unheard of. It's a good land where agricultural practices can be used, where bushes and shrubs and fruits and vegetables can be cultivated, where livestock can be grazed. And yet, the Torah ends without the Israelites having entered the Promised Land. I love the honesty of the Scriptures. It's not just a bunch of nice spiritual statements, although there are certainly lots of spiritual statements. It anchors our spiritual reality in historical narrative, people who are broken and make mistakes just like us. And so often it is how we respond to those situations that really determines our lives. What we get to experience, the connection that we have with God and one another, the peace that we can embrace. And God doesn't leave us in a complete lurch. Because if we turn to Deuteronomy, the very last book of the Torah, Moses is part of that generation that's going to die in the wilderness and not get to go in because of his and the nation's disobedience. And God tells Moses in front of all of Israel, he says to them, "Be strong and courageous, do not be afraid or terrified. God will never leave you or forsake you." And later Moses turns to Joshua, who is to take over as leader of Israel, and says to him, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged." If you're struggling with your self-worth, if you're just down because you're stressed about your job or about finances, or there are real struggles in your family relationships right now because of what's going on, I pray that you would reach out to someone who can help you and to cry out to God, who will never leave you nor forsake you either. May it be so. In the Scriptures that we belong to God, that we're His children, His sons and daughters, and we're called to walk in obedience with Him. Is the theme of obedience and disobedience between the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, and God's commands to them. God will tell them, do this or refrain from that. Not because he's a control freak, but because he created each human being. He even created you and me. And he knows what's best for us. Just like courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified. God will never leave you or forsake you. And later Moses turns to Joshua, who is to take over as leader of Israel, and says to him, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged.